Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes, you can hear me. Great. Thank you, Nick. It's so nice to be here for so many reasons. It's my first time traveling for a conference since the pandemic. And bonus points because you all know how to pronounce my surname. In German-speaking countries, this is one of the benefits, right? So I'm Ben. I'm a designer by trade. Just the quick, short version is that the last few years I've been specializing in voice and conversational interfaces. I've worked in health tech, and I've been training people through O'Reilly all over the world in how to design for voice. And the really cool thing I got to do through that is train people how to design at NASA for voice. So I think I can kind of die happy now, right? Now that I've done that, I'm just like, okay, I'm done. So I am going to talk to you about sort of what's happening now in voice, and the future. And especially now that we're at this point where the kind of hype has died down a little bit. But I'm going to start with a bit of a quiz. So I'm going to read you some stuff, and your job is to guess how old this quote is, okay? So here we go. There is only one condition in which we can imagine managers not needing subordinates and masters not needing slaves. This condition would be that each instrument could do its own work at the word of command or by intelligent anticipation. Okay, so how old is this quote?
50 years.
All right, let's put some hands up as I read some time frames. Okay, so we have 50 years. Anybody else for 50 years? Put your hand up. 70. Okay, let's go higher. 100. 200. 500. 1,000. 2,000. Okay. Maybe more? More? Anybody got more than 2,000 years old? Okay. So that was Aristotle who said that. And it seems at the moment like Aristotle's dream of being able to speak and to command machines is actually starting to come true. And there's a lovely symmetry here because Aristotle's really the godfather of logic, which gives us computing. So it seems like two of his dreams about history are coming true. But as we all know, speaking to machines still feels a bit like this. And to illustrate my point, I'm going to play you a short video.
Call Gerardo.
Name unknown.
Call Gerardo.
Name unknown.
Call Gerardo.
Calling Gerardo.
Hey, Gerardo.
So I think we've all had moments like this with our voice interfaces, right? I just want to mention that this is a short clip from a film called Curious Rituals. And the reason you should watch the whole film is that it's about this thing called mundane futures, right? So it's about how the future really arrives, not the version that big tech companies sell us, this kind of dreamlike utopia, but actually when it arrives, it's often kind of a little bit shit, a little bit broken. And that's the way that voice interfaces have kind of arrived to us. They're kind of not super reliable. And they have an extra disadvantage because our sound environment, our aural environment, is much messier than the environments like screens and touch, right? There's a lot more interference going on. Take, noises in the background or, the variety of accents, for example. But the dream, really, that we've had for the last few decades is to make computers work the way we do. With screens, we're forcing a mode of interaction, and we've been discovering how to make it natural. But of course, speech, hundreds of thousands of years old. And our expectations are that old as well, right? That's why voice interfaces can feel so disappointing, because actually it's our evolution that sets those expectations, right? We're used to speaking to people and getting good results from a general intelligence. So, if there's only one thing you take from my talk, it is this. What was wrong with that interaction we just watched in the video is that it didn't fail gracefully, right? It didn't recognize the name, that's one problem, but also the group of people, and you can probably guess who they are, because I don't think they involve designers, they actually were making it just do this horribly repetitious error message. So my one piece of advice, if you take only one thing, it is this. Make a conversational interface fail gracefully. Okay, let's talk about today. So magical AI assistants are not coming anytime soon despite the hype, but conversation is a niche growing mode of interaction. That's what's happening now. Organizations should grow their capability and experiment, and then I'm going to talk about possible longer term futures as well. Okay, moving on. I want to make one important sort of caveat to this talk, which is that the rules for a voice and a chat-based interface are very different. The interface problems that you experience can be very different, but they are both powered by a conversational AI, or as it is sometimes known, NLU, natural language understanding. So while the interface rules are different, actually the common thing that powers both of them is the same, and improvements to that back end will obviously improve the front end as well. I'm going to talk a little bit sort of interchangeably about both of them today. So let's talk about now, and I'll try and just do a really very short history just so we understand where we are today. So we have this period of a few decades called what I call the faking it period. And it begins with Audrey Bell Labs 1952. A machine the size of a house lets one person only, speak 10 digits, 1 to 10. So that's where it starts. And then in those first few decades, nothing hits the consumer space, really. It's all about making those kind of fundamental breakthroughs. And they're nothing more than fancy demos. But there are some important breakthroughs in the background. Then we get to desktop computing in the 90s, and you see things like drag and dictate, where you can dictate a document reasonably well, but not with particularly great reliability. And in this phase, consumers start to be exposed to voice through phone systems, for example, but you have this thing called fixed grammars, where you have to use exact words. They're not very tolerant of what you say, and it kind of sucks. This is where voice interfaces start to get a bad reputation. And then we have what I call the crappy wizards phase. Actually, I didn't call it this. I can't remember who said it, but it wasn't me. So anyway, from 2010 onwards, we have the era of deep learning, machine learning, and we start to get products like Siri and Alexa. And we start to learn that actually, yeah, we can use this for stuff, and it is relatively reliable, but actually all we're really using it for most of the time is as a glorified remote control. Think Harry Potter. Hey, give me that thing or turn that thing on, right? Which is why we call it the crappy wizards phase. Also in this time, we have the rise of the chatbot. And I was really not into chatbots for a very, very long time. I thought they universally sucked. But I have come around a bit, and I've softened my position. And just to give you one example, which I've actually improved my own mental health with, is this product called Wobot Health. Really fantastic product. I highly recommend everybody try it. It's a really awesome product, and the evidence shows it is genuinely helping people with their mental health. One thing I will add about this, which is interesting and important and not very well understood, is that it is a conversational product that is on Rails. It doesn't use a lot of deep learning, machine learning to kind of generate AI-based responses. Actually, it's very, very tightly scripted and designed. Now, what kind of vision did Google sell us a few years ago in 2018 of what voice interfaces were going to be like? Let me play you a short clip.
So how can I help you?
Hi, I'm calling to book a women's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something on May 3rd.
Sure, give me 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, what time are you looking for around?
At 12 p.m.
We do not have a 12 p.m. available. The closest we have to that is a 1:15.
Okay, so this is Google Duplex, presented in 2018, and it was mind-blowing at the time in terms of what it could do. It's worth watching the whole demo. But I want to reveal a couple of key facts about this, right, that actually kind of puncture the hype. So the first is that this demo is impressive because it is taking place over the phone. Why is that important? Because the system knows who is speaking at any one time. So our far-field technology, our smart speakers, are not very good at understanding actually who is speaking at any one time. You don't have things like eye contact. It cannot distinguish very well between two speakers. But one of the reasons Duplex works well is because it's only two people speaking on a phone line. The second thing you should know, and this is sort of on the grapevine stuff through industry insiders, is that actually, although it appears to be a magical AI that can have super fluid natural conversations, again, it is tightly scripted. The designers worked on this for a very, very long time, thinking through all of the possibilities. And when it was deployed live, you had people monitoring it constantly, and it could be interrupted by the humans. So these fancy AI-based tech demos, actually, when you look behind the scenes, they're not quite as reliable or ready for the mainstream as we might think. So let's talk about, now we've talked about the sort of recent dreams of what voice was going to be capable of. Let's talk about what's happening in usage. So also in 2018, we saw graphs like this, where it was projected that smart speaker sales would continue through the roof, mostly across the world, at the same rate of growth. That is not how things played out. If you look at the percentages on this graph, you will see that in the US, for example, and this is broadly true elsewhere, the growth of smart speakers has quite considerably slowed down to the point where it's about half the population, and that growth is shrinking quite considerably year on year. What are people using them for? Well, it's sort of the same old stuff, right? It's this crappy wizard style things, right? Play music, ask a question, check weather, set timers, alarms. Not terribly deep usage. It seems like for most consumers, voice has found this fairly kind of shallow daily niche. Then we see headlines like this. The important thing I'll call out here is third-party voice app usage not growing. So when these voice platforms started to emerge, there was this dream that other organizations would be able to connect to consumers. You know, you could speak to your energy company through your smart speaker. You'd be able to have all these great conversations with the services you use. That has absolutely not happened. People do this very, very rarely indeed. And we'll talk about why in a moment. And Alexa is one of Amazon's biggest investments, but they have realized for a long time that usage has stalled. So there's this very common pattern when people get a smart speaker or a voice-enabled device. They experiment, this is honeymoon period, so they experiment for a few weeks often, and they're trying new things, they're figuring out what works, but there is also a period of disappointment. Oh, I'm speaking to an intelligent being, but there are a million things that I try and it cannot do. And so then people fall into this sort of possibly lifelong flatline, right? Of I'm just going to use it for the same things over and over and over again. And so we would guess that Amazon is spending huge amounts of money trying to break their users out of this pattern, and it is not proving to be the platform that it was promised to be. Why is that? Well, Benedict Evans, I don't know if you know him, a great thinker, do sign up to his newsletter. He has this idea that voice usage is U-shaped. So at a small number of use cases, it's awesome because you can remember what it can do. But a voice-only device is a bit like standing in a dark room not knowing what it can do. Because when you get up to 100 use cases, you simply can't remember all the things it can and cannot do. And so it's sort of a mystery when you have a wider number of things it can do. But the sort of utopia for this is that you can say and do anything like another intelligent being. So that would be, you know, thousands and thousands of use cases and doing them reliably. And we are an unknown period of time away from being able to do that. And it isn't just the AI and the raw intelligence of the system that determines this. So we just don't know when we're going to start sort of traveling up the U-curve again. But there are some growing niches. Much as smart speaker growth has slowed down, we see growth in places like automotive. Lots and lots of healthcare use cases are taking off, both professionally and for consumers. And if you think professionally, there are lots of hands-free contexts where this stuff is useful. And probably the biggest growth area that we see at the moment in conversational AI is in just service, right? Augmenting humans with automation. And I think that really is one of the big futures that we'll see in the next few years, right? Where we can try to solve problems quickly with an AI, but then gracefully hand over to humans, be that in a chatbot or over the phone with a customer call center line. So let's talk about what voice is good for, sort of fundamentally? Well, my analogy here would be, imagine you're ordering a coffee, let's say in a Dutch coffee shop here. When you go up to the counter, you're actually looking at the menu, you're reading, right? You're taking in the options via visual means. And that's actually the best way to do that, because when you take something in by visual means, you don't have to remember things, right? So voice is not a particularly good output mode. It can be for some cases, I'll come back to that. But in general day-to-day usefulness, it's not a great sort of output method. You know, screens are often better for that. I don't know if you've had that moment in a restaurant where the waiter is serving you or the waitress is serving you, and they tell you the specials for the day, and by the time they've got to the last one, you've forgotten the first one, right? That's often what a voice interface is like. But then you give your order and you refine it with the person through your voice, and that's the sort of ideal mix. So, voice is a great mode of input. It's also good in these hands-free contexts, like cooking, the car, when you're, standing up and ordering something. Command and control, that's that crappy wizard. Search and shortcuts. If you start to think about playing music over voice, and it still kind of feels quite magical to me that I can sort of say, hey, Spotify, give me any old music, and it will play it reasonably reliably. But if you think about the number of steps you are shortcutting compared to a screen, it's absolutely magical. I take my phone out of my pocket, I unlock it, I find Spotify, I tap Spotify, I start searching for the music. There's a lot of steps involved in an interaction like that, and voice is a very quick shortcut through that. And then aural media, right? So think podcasts, audio, storytelling. That's where voice and mixing voice into that is good. But as we've touched on with this cafe example, there's this kind of multimodal spectrum. It may be that the future of voice just isn't particularly great or useful on its own. This is a slide that Google obviously quite often use, that we should be thinking about the future of voice as it is mixed into other means, and we'll come back to the ways in which that might happen in a moment. So now we're over this sort of, Gartner hype cycle of smart speakers and voice interfaces. It turns out that screen interfaces are better for complex interactions than conversational interfaces. And I think we all kind of knew this. This isn't like super insightful, right? But cutting through the hype, this is where we've landed today. But, that doesn't mean it's not useful. There are some really interesting opportunities. So let's talk about what's next. And I want to kind of give the context to next with some trends. So most recently, we've all seen, things like DALL-E on Twitter, right? I love this court sketch of Godzilla on trial. I kind of want the comedy sketch version of this now, right? I want to hear Godzilla on trial, like what happens in the courtroom when they accuse him of destroying cities. Maybe an AI could write this. In fact, this next tool that I'm going to talk about does exactly that, right? So this is an AI-based writing tool called Jasper. So what I'm touching on here is that although we tend to think of AI as the machine that powers an interaction with a user, maybe the best use for it over the next few years is powering the creator, powering the designers, powering the product teams to make better products. Tools like VoiceFlow, which is very commonly used to design voice interfaces, already are starting to build AI into the creation process. So imagine you're a designer or a content person, and when you design, you're seeing the best path, the best possible next response, or helping you to design. But it turns you not into the pure creator, but more of a curator. You are artistically picking and choosing the best options from a set that the IA presents you with. And tools like this from Nuance are already starting to do this. They were recently bought by Microsoft, but they had this great tool called Pathfinder. And what Pathfinder would do is it would take a massive load of conversations. It would just take like all the call center data, and then it would just crunch it all and say, right, this is the best path through this conversation for a user. So it doesn't tell you, it doesn't power that conversation directly, but it tells you as the creators, hey, this is the best way to handle this conversation. All right. Another thing that I think is happening at the moment is what I call channel savviness, or getting better at service design. So the example I use here is KLM. All right, so what they've been really good at over the past few years and continuing to do is choosing the right mode of input and output for the right stage of the user journey. So booking a flight is very, very complex. You need a screen, right? You're doing that over the web or perhaps the app. But then, when you're in the pre-travel phase, the interactions are actually really often very short. So questions and answers, notifications, these are short, tiny interactions. And KLM actually will push you to things like Facebook Messenger for these interactions. And that's good for another reason, because you have Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or whatever conversational means it is right in front of you. It's right there. It's with you. You don't have to think about typing in the address or anything like that. And then finally, you might actually use your ticket on the app again. So using service design to figure out where in the customer's journey or the user's journey a conversation or interface is best used. So let's talk about some opportunities that present themselves. And there is some really serious return on investment from organizations thinking about how good they are at producing conversations. One quick one from Autodesk's case study, I believe this is powered mostly by IBM technology. So when they implemented a new virtual agent, they saw a 10% uplift in their CSAT scores, their customer satisfaction scores, and their resolution time for problems that customers were presenting went from 1.5 days with the humans to 5 minutes with the AI. And that is pretty substantial. And what it also means is that humans can then deal with the more complex problems. It actually makes the job of an agent, a customer service agent, better when the crappy, boring, repetitive stuff is taken away from them. Okay, so most organizations need to think about building conversational capability, and broadly there are sort of 3 areas: research and strategy, design, UX and content, and then obviously development, backend. What powers that? And there's some fundamental things that I think are often missed in this. So one is content strategy. The UK government's digital service, GDS, I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're incredible pioneers in the field of sort of designing for civic means, right, for designing for the public. And what they started to realize was that their content was not suitable for other means, right? So they were thinking originally about pages, but when Alexa started to read out pieces of information that users were asking for, in this case, when is the next public holiday, they realized that a lot of the content was not well written for short or other means. So what they started to do was to figure out what is the minimum viable content for a question, right? So when you answer this question on screen, you can put more information there, but actually if it's a conversational means like voice or chat, you want the quick, short answer. So they've started to rethink the fundamentals of their content based on how quickly it can be displayed or spoken to a customer. And it turns out that voice tends to be the sort of minimum. If you remember in the mobile era, we started to think, okay, mobile first. And designing mobile first allows us to expand outwards. It turns out that voice is broadly similar. If you can get an interaction right in voice, it is fairly easy to expand it out to other means. Not necessarily true. In fact, it's generally horrible if, for example, you take a chatbot and just stick it straight into voice. Another related problem is the silos of content. So you very often find an organization is giving the same answers, but powered by different technology with different providers, and it's all locked into different systems under the management of different teams. And I can't tell you how often I've sort of encountered this problem, and how resistant organizations can be to providing some sort of central answer or central content repository. And we won't get this right in the long run unless we can start to centralize these answers and figure out things like, write once, publish anywhere. Another thing that's starting to happen in this space is maturity models. So if you've seen maturity models for things like digital transformation or UX and design, well, there are a few organizations who are starting to think we need to provide our organizations with a roadmap. How well do we produce conversations? So Capgemini have one, VoiceFlow have published one, but the one I'll focus on today is this one. VUX World is a popular podcast in the space, and they've been actually thinking about producing a maturity model. And you can actually go and take a quiz down the bottom right. There's the link if you want to go and see where your organization is at being able to produce conversations and AI-powered conversations down here. Okay. So that's sort of the opportunities for organizations. Let's talk about some future stuff. And I'm going to freely preface this by a lot of what I'm going to say is sort of Western-centric. There are other means and options and cultures that we could be looking to, but I freely admit this is kind of biased. So I want to talk about, again, there are more options than this, but I'm going to present some binary options for common visions that we've had about where voice is going. And the first one is what I would call sort of assistive AI, and a really famous example of this is, Star Trek: Next Generation. And in Star Trek: The Next Generation from late 80s, early 90s, we see that the character, if you want to call it that, of computer is never really treated as a person, right? It's never really, it doesn't even really have personality. The voice is natural but kind of robotic sounding. And so there's never a sense that, there is a personified entity in any way, or that it even has a consciousness. Although obviously Star Trek does explore that through the character of Data. And this vision for our magical AI conversational future is contrasted to this one. So have people seen this movie, Spike Jonze's Her? I cannot recommend how important it is that people in computing watch this, or tech, because it presents a really fundamental and beautiful vision, not just the AI, about where computing will take us. It is an incredibly well-designed, thoughtful movie. Please, please, please watch it. But there's a thing that happens in this movie, which is that the protagonist, Theodore, falls in love with his new AI assistant, Samantha, as voiced by Scarlett Johansson. And I want to say that I actually think this is a mistake about where our vision is going, right, for voice. And it's not just because I think that a machine having a consciousness is just a completely unknown amount of time away, or that, it's silly. It's just, actually what we want is to focus on ourselves, on human interactions and social interactions. There's a couple of points in the movie where it's slightly critical of this, right? Where everyone in a lift is speaking to their AI and ignoring each other. We don't want to produce situations where, AI is taking away, or conversational interfaces are taking away from our lives. They should be augmenting it. So I personally am more on the side of assistive. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't have some personality or it isn't designed in a way that's good for humans. And so I came up a few years ago with this principle that you can use if you want to: humane, not human. And Google used sort of a slightly similar version of this. I have no idea whether they copied it from me or not. But this is my kind of guiding principle for this kind of work. I don't want to take away people from their lives, but we do want to make interfaces that are useful and kind to our users. Now let's talk about one of the kind of main problems when we even use the word AI. Marvin Minsky said that the phrase AI is a suitcase phrase or word. Why is it a suitcase phrase? Because it requires a lot of unpacking. And so we tend to abuse its use. So we have visions in our fiction of what AI is going to do in future. And I want to use the anthropologist's Genevieve Bell, who was at Intel, as a sort of touchstone for what we should think about this. And she said that when we encounter revolutionary new technology, what tends to happen in the West is that we use a Christian lens to kind of assess it, right? It's either going to be heaven or hell. And if you think about this, the Terminator was a perfect example of this bias, right? Because Skynet and what it's going to do to the world is a vision of hell. The Terminator is a demon. Samantha in Her is this angelic being, And so what we've got to remember is that actually that when the future arrives, it's usually somewhere in between. It's more mundane. It's problematic in various ways. It's not this one or the other. So why is AI, what are the fundamental reasons why AI is overhyped? Well, or rather, why do people constantly sort of overestimate it in terms of what it's going to do for us? Well, there's this great book on the subject, The Myth of Artificial Intelligence by Eric Larson, and he really highlights that inference or abductive reasoning is another way of putting it, is what human AI stuff is, right? Or human intelligence. And the point he makes is that we have absolutely no clue how to replicate that kind of intelligence. The sort of stuff we see in deep learning today doesn't even come close. No matter how cool the demo is, we are not even aware of how our own brains do this. So why would we think we can even build this into machines? And this bears out, as we saw earlier with Google Duplex. Because when we see fancy demos or cutting-edge AI technology, it will do unreliable things. It will, even criticize the company that built the thing, And so I can't tell you how often I've seen these mistakes and bias. And it really does have deeply negative effects. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was working on an Alexa product proof of concept, and I was testing it with users in London, and I started testing it with people of color from the Black Afro-Caribbean community. And Alexa, it couldn't understand the word ask, the way that particular community uses the word ask. They say it slightly differently in the UK. And so it produced this horribly racist outcome, right? Which is that they couldn't even use the product with commonly spoken language used millions of times a day in London, one of the biggest cities in the world. Now, nobody at Amazon was trying to produce racist outcomes. None of them are particularly racist, I know this. But that's what AI-based algorithms often do. They reflect our own biases if we don't code them well. And so mind-blowing AI demos do not equal reliable, unbiased products. And we really must remember this every time we see things like DALL-E or GPT-3, whatever new technology. The fundamental question is, does it do it reliably, and is it unbiased? Okay, so now I'm going to make some foolhardy predictions. I'm always a bit reluctant, but people always ask me, what's next, Ben? And I'm going to sort of make a few mostly safe predictions about what's going to happen in voice and conversational AI. And the first is really a pattern that we see quite common in industry, which you might call off-the-shelf conversations. I think we'll see this in the next few years. As the design and the training gets better for domain-specific conversations, let's just say travel, right? In the future, we will see companies that sell a travel-based conversation to, let's say, a travel agency. And it can have reliable conversations about travel bookings or flights to a much higher degree than we can see today. And they can just kind of plug it into their APIs and their booking systems, and customers will be able to talk to something using this off-the-shelf package. But there's a limitation behind the scenes, which we've sort of touched on a little bit, which is that AI remains domain-specific. So it won't be able to switch subjects intelligently like this. So if you book a table at a restaurant, you won't then be able to talk about what are the best local dishes that we should try. It just won't have that kind of domain expertise when you start talking to it about something else. And so the conversations that remain smart and useful and pleasant to use will be those that are kind of narrow and pleasant to use, but kind of directed in a way. They will stay on topic. Okay. But then another development that we saw with Duplex, and we will see this more and more commonly, is that artificial voices become near indistinguishable from humans. We're seeing a lot of, experimentation with, those. Have you seen those face demos where they can replicate, a deep fake, for example, and even do it live? Just a quick example on a practical note from the BBC. They are playing around with a Microsoft technology called Songbird, and it can do things like this.
Hello there, I'm the BBC's new synthetic voice. Are you tired of multitasking? The ancient art of splitting your attention in too many directions at once. I can help you with that, to free up your eyes and hands. I'll be reading articles from bbc.com, keeping you informed while you get on with that to-do list.
So they've switched it off recently, and I'm not sure why, but they were experimenting so that on a lot of the news articles, you could just hit play and it would read out the news. And the articles were beautifully well read. Like, they really nailed it, I think. It was just completely natural sounding, very close to what you would expect from a real-life newsreader. And of course, that's a great bonus for accessibility. There are use cases, they're quite niche, but they are brilliant at utilizing the best things that voice is good for. Now, ASR, automated speech recognition, will increase over the next few years as we start to train data on a wider variety of dialects or different communities. And so the error rate, we've sort of bottomed out. We're now in that sort of getting the 99.9% for a lot of these systems. And so we will continue to see very slow but incremental steady progress in this field. We've had 10 years of like incredible improvements in this stuff, but actually it's going to slow down steadily over time. Now, this is a more speculative one, but I think it's a safer bet than, let's say, advanced general intelligence or AI, which is whatever happens in AR. We know companies are investing billions right now in AR. And it seems likely that whatever AR products emerge and become ubiquitous, if indeed they do, voice will probably be a part of that mix because it's such a great thing to do when you're in a hands-free context. Let's say a glass-based product takes off if Apple has anything to do with it. I believe they've been demonstrating something internally, but again, this is highly speculative at this point. Another thing I will say about the next few years is that capability will be heavily limited by standards, infrastructure, and monopolistic capitalism. What do I mean by that? Well, if we think about, here's a thing that I do, and I recommend you do this yourself, right? Go through your day and start thinking about all the questions you have and what it would take to answer that question or for the technology to be able to fulfill your request. So a common one I had the other day was, when is my next tax bill due and how much do I owe? Imagine I could speak something like that to my voice assistant and have them pay it for me. And then think about all the challenges that we'd have to overcome to do something like that. It's an incredible number of challenges, extraordinarily difficult. And it's not even the intelligence anymore. It's like connecting to third-party services, right? So connecting to my desktop software. How does the voice assistant do that when I'm somewhere else in the world, right? Well, how does it have permission to speak to my bank and pay the bill and all those kind of complicated issues? And then, of course, these things are limited by monopolistic capitalism, where the standards aren't really being worked on in an open-ended way, right? Alexa, Amazon doesn't want really for me to go into the Google ecosystem or to the Apple ecosystem. But I'm somebody who uses a lot of different things, and I have a lot of different devices all over the place, and I need these systems to talk to each other. And I can't actually foresee a future where that will change anytime soon. So we will see. I'm skeptical about how soon that will change. Now, we have context as a key challenge, particularly social context. Doug Kitlaus, he was one of the creators of Siri, he said this: to make it natural and socially aware, an AI would need massively scaled real-time image recognition, spatial understanding, facial and mood recognition, as well as an understanding of the subtleties of thousands of social scenarios. So what we would need for a voice interface to really understand the context that we as humans are in is an incredible challenge. And I really don't want to say how soon we will be able to crack this nut. But there is incredible richness to things that we do every day that we take for granted. And if AI ever, or technology, not even just AI, if technology ever cracks this, it will be a miracle. Even something I've mentioned before, like eye contact, which is fundamental to conversation. We don't really have technology in everyday use that can help the technology understand it. So I'm going to close now. One way I like to think about the difference between screens and voices is think about crossing a chasm. This is my metaphor. A user is crossing a chasm, right? Now, when you have a screen-based interaction, it's solid, right? They can see what's there, they can see their options. It has guardrails when you're crossing the bridge. It's like a bridge, right? and it's steady and sturdy and you know where you're going. But a conversational interface is often wobbly and unsteady, and the further you walk on the tightrope, the more likely you are to fall off it, right? The longer the interactions are, the more likely they are to go wrong. And so we can't really change the way that these systems are unreliable or difficult, because there are some fundamental challenges that I have touched on, like our sound environment. But our job when we create these conversational interfaces is effectively to widen the tightrope. Right? That's our job, is to just make it a little bit wider, a little bit safer to cross that chasm. And I want to leave you with one final thought by the founder of something called ubiquitous, or an idea called ubiquitous technology. Mark Reiser said, "The most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it." And I can't think of a human technology that really sort of matches this. We don't think of conversation, human conversation, as a technology, but it is. And it's existed with us for a very, very long time, and it's become invisible and taken for granted. And now we're at this point where we need to think about how we make the technology invisible to ourselves and embed it into our everyday lives. That is our job. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. That was really interesting, fascinating stuff. Thank you. Looks like we have a couple questions. We have a little bit of time before we have to switch over to the next speaker. So let's start here. Monica asks, could you give some examples of how you apply AI principle, humane, not humane?
Human. Humane, not human.
Sorry, humane, not human.
Yeah, sure. So, for example, one thing I've seen quite often is design teams trying to inject personality too early into a system. So they'll try to be charming or funny when a user is in a get stuff done kind of mode, right? Now, being charming and funny and personality driven is appropriate, but you have to know when it's appropriate. So you can't just kind of try to be all funny and human from the word go. So one thing we did at Babylon was that we would delay a little bit of humor or a touch of personality until later. So if we encountered an error message too often, we would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a bit broken today," right? We would kind of inject some light jokes about the repetitive errors to speak to that earlier video that I showed you, right? Which was, name unknown. And so that moment where they're encountering an error, that's an appropriate moment to just be a little bit self-deprecating, but not doing it up front, right? That's really, really important. Just get out of the way of the user. Be functional at first. Yeah.
Thank you. Here's from Felix. Ben, philosophical question. Do you see the potential that AI can blur or redefine our sense of reality?
Oh, goodness. Where do I even begin with that question? I think if it does, it's a long way away. So that's the first thing I would say. I would maybe just reframe the question to, have technologies done that to ourselves in the past? And I would say yes. So the pencil, right? I'm not kidding. Pencil or paper, reading and writing. Has that fundamentally changed the way we think about ourselves? Putting our thoughts on paper and transmitting it to another human, that has fundamentally changed how we're able to empathize. And some speculate that it has reduced how violent we are to each other, although there are obviously some controversies around that. But I would say if it is as revolutionary when it works, yes. But who knows when? Yeah.
Cool. And maybe just one quick, I have a question here.
Yeah.
It's a yes/no question.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible for a machine to have a consciousness? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Yes or no? Right now, no. No. I say no. Yeah.
Okay. Ben Sauer, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.